Hello to our viewers at home and welcome to the second day of Icon Festival. I'm glad you chose to join us. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Nadav Almog and I'm a translator, editor, and critic. I've recently finished my PhD in English literature, specializing in children's literature and YA. I'm also the editor of the website, The Fantastic Library. Today, we are honored to have with us author Stéphanie Bרג'iis. Originally from Michigan in the US, Stéphanie Bרג'iis lives in Wales with her husband and two sons. She writes books for middle grade and adults, as well as short stories for teens and adults. Two of her books, The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart and The Girl with the Dragon Heart, have been translated to Hebrew and published by Utz Publishing House. Stéphanie, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, so without further ado, let us delve right in and start with the first question. So how did you become a children's writer, or rather middle grade author?
Well, the way it started was that I was living in Vienna and I was there to study music history. But of course, like every reader, I was desperate for books to read just for my own entertainment while I was there. And there was only one place where I could read books in English pretty much for free. And that was at the English Council Library in Vienna. And it was such a tiny library. So first I worked my way through all the adult books and I had run out of books. And so I started reading in the children's section out of desperation, really. And I was so taken aback by how much I loved it. I absolutely fell in love. I couldn't believe I'd ever stopped reading children's books. And I had so much fun that I immediately started thinking about stories of my own. And so that was, although I came to children's literature through a moment of readerly desperation, I've stayed ever since because I fell so hard in love with it.
How long ago was that?
Ooh, that was a long time. Let's see, the first time, that would have been 1999 to 2000. Yeah.
Okay. So who are your main sources of inspiration?
Ooh, so many. A lot of the writers I grew up loving and admiring and wanting to emulate are actually, there are some adult authors among them, of course, like Ellen Kushner, and Terry Windling, Delia Sherman, Emma Bull, this whole collection who really influenced me as a teenager learning to write fantasy. And they still influence me hugely. But also, you know, Robin McKinley was a huge influence, who does both YA and adults. Hilary Mackay, now working in the UK, is amazing. She writes both contemporary, realistic, middle grade, and middle grade fantasy. Her latest book, A Time of Green Magic, is one of my favorite middle grade fantasies from the last few years. And of course, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. I'm actually just now reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time to my 12-year-old. So I'm getting to enjoy that all over again. And it feels very magical all over again.
Did you start with The Hobbit?
Yes, we did that a few years earlier, but there's such a big tone shift between the books.
Yeah.
That we took a little break in between.
By the way, both Ellen and Delia were at Icon. They visited us.
Oh, wonderful.
So...
Yes, Ellen and Delia are wonderful. I actually have one of your t-shirts because Ellen and Delia, when they came to Wales last year, they brought me a t-shirt.
That's awesome. Do you yourself, I mean, to this day, read children's literature and YA literature for fun or for research or for both?
Well, I would read it for fun, but I also read it for research because I think it's really important to read widely in whatever genre you want to write. And that means keeping up with it also.
Excuse me, Stéphanie, just 1 second. We seem to have a technical issue. Okay. I'm sorry. And we're back.
No worries.
You were
All
saying.
right. So Yes, I would read middle grade and YA just for fun. But because I publish in middle grade, I also read for research because I think it's really important as a writer to keep up with whatever field you're writing in. And otherwise, you can miss out on fantastic developments and you can stagnate yourself, honestly. So it's, and also something I would say to newer writers is one of the biggest problems that I see with new writers wanting to write their first middle grade book is that they're basing it on the kinds of books they grew up with, which are often very, very different from what's published nowadays. And you need to be aware of the changes that have happened in the meantime, and you need to be writing something that is actually going to fit on the shelf with everything else.
Mm-hmm. And why focus on middle grade? I mean, we have children's literature, we have YA. So why specifically middle grade?
Well, you know, the most honest answer is that it's the most fun for me to read and to write. But when I ask myself what makes it the most fun, it's probably I love the sense of wonder in middle grade. It's middle grade books are long enough and they're for mature enough readers that you can make wonderful, complicated, magical systems, and you can address sort of big moral issues even. But at the same time, they're full of a sheer wonder. When I go to a school and I talk to kids, the kind of responses I get are so different from what I do. And for adults, no matter, even adults who really love the book are being discussed, because there's a sort of sophistication that we learn to put on as we get older. And
just 1 second.
Children haven't done that yet.
We didn't hear you very well. Could you try and?
I'm not hearing anything.
I think the connection wasn't very good. Could you repeat your answer?
Frustrating.
I'm sorry.
Yes, it is technical.
Your connection is a bit problematic. It's on your end, and try to reconnect with the cable if you have the option.
Okay, we don't have a cable. Let me see if I can, just a second. I'm closing off everything else that has access to the internet in hopes that that'll take care of, at least it won't be struggling as much. Oh, don't crash, silly machine. All right, are you still there?
Yes, we are. Okay, so you were saying.
Right. So I was saying that kids approach magic with a very different attitude than adults do because it's their first time reading about it. It's the first time you'll get these ideas and these images in a lot of kids' heads. And it's so exciting. It's a really wonderful opportunity. And it's a different kind of opportunity than with adult fantasy, where often what you're looking for is you want to do a slightly different twist on a familiar trope that you all love. And that's really fun too. But it's not the same. And I love that sense of wonder and introducing magic to kids' worlds.
Your biography states that you are a graduate of the Clarion West Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop. To those at home unfamiliar with Clarion, it's a very famous and prestigious workshop for writers. How would you say this affected your career and your writing?
Hugely. It's the best decision I ever made for my writing career and my writing itself. It's a 6-week residential workshop. And literally within those 6 weeks, I was watching my writing get better and better. And that's not something that normally happens. It hasn't happened at any other stage of my life, because normally you improve by these very small increments, no matter how hard you're working. But it's such an intense hotbed. You spend 6 weeks living with about 16 other writers, accepted through competitive application. And every single day, some people will turn in new stories. Everyone is supposed to turn in at least one story a week for the 6 weeks. So you have to write incredibly quickly under pressure. And then you have to critique everybody else's stories. And actually, pretty much everyone, at least in my class, when we were starting out, thought the most useful thing would be the stories we wrote. But the most useful thing for me as a writer long term has been learning how to critique, because you go around in the circle of 17 people and you'd each give your response to the story with what you liked and what suggestions you have and what didn't work for you. And then you hear the teacher at the end. There's always one professional, like some of ours were Connie Willis and Jack Womack and Octavia Butler and Nelda Hopkinson. So you get their feedback at the end, sort of tying everything together. And not only does it teach you, first of all, that there's no objective truth when it comes to what makes a story good or bad, because 17 people will never agree on everything. But it also teaches you how to analyze stories. And when you learn how to analyze someone else's story, you learn how to analyze your own stories. And it makes your writing so much better. And it gives you so many more tools. So as a writer, it's humongously helpful. But then also it gave me a network of friends and an entryway to the science fiction community that was just priceless. I mean, I went farther than most because I married one of my classmates, which is not, I'm not the person, but mostly it's about making these friendships that will support you through the years of working to get better and better and better, and working in a very stressful career of writing where you need people on your side and you need a support team.
Do we know with you?
Oh, who my classmates were? Sorry, I'm just...
If we know any one of them. If anyone else.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Benjamin Rosenbaum, who has his first novel coming out this year from Erewhon Books. And before we even started Clarion, he'd had his first short story published in the magazine of science fiction. And Barry Goldman has had a few of his middle grade books and books published now. Kini Salam is an amazing, beautiful writer. And we've got actually... If you ever just look up Clarion West Class of 2001, we've had a pretty amazing list, because I'm not even... I think we figured out at some point that every single person from our class had published, and that's not not always true, even at Clarion.
Cool. Moving on, children's literature and YA literature are supposedly meant for juvenile audiences, and yet more and more adults come out admitting that they read them too. What do you think is the appeal of such works for adults?
I think there's a whole lot of that. I mean, first of all, I would start by challenging the idea that they're supposed to be for a juvenile audience. I would say, if you look at the age ranges that are suggested with children's books, you'll generally see, for 5-year-olds and up, for 9-year-olds and up, for 10-year-olds, and up can be as far as you like. Really, when we're looking at age ranges, we're looking at how old you have to be before you can understand and appreciate this book. There isn't a cutoff point where it won't work for you anymore necessarily. Mm-hmm. So, right now I'm 43, but inside myself, I still have memories of me at 30. I have memories of me at 14. I have memories of me at 9. So I don't lose the ability to empathize with, say, a 10-year-old, or any more than I would with a 25-year-old. Mm-hmm. I just gain more experience as I go along, and I think that's true of most people. And so there's never a cutoff point when you stop being able to feel interest and compassion in the problems of people younger than yourself. But also, I would say there's a lot of appeal for adults, particularly now, in a very dark time in the world, in getting to, I would say, from the perspective of an adult reading children's literature, escape to a slightly simpler time, possibly in their life, when there may be many issues facing you, but at least you're not worried about being the person who, pays the bills. You're not worried about keeping the house over your head, etc. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's not a way that I read children's literature when I was a child. But as an adult, I can enjoy that.
Could you repeat that? You got cut off a little. Could you repeat the
yes.
last bit?
Oh, okay. Well, let's see, what was the last thing you heard?
Up until the last sentence.
All right, well, I would just say that as a kid, when you read middle grade literature, you're reading about the issues that are really important to you right then. And that's great. That's really sad. That's very cathartic and satisfying. As an adult, reading middle grade literature, you get to go back to a time in your life when you had fewer issues, maybe, or you had the issues you had weren't complicated by having to be the responsible adult in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You're probably still worried about friendships and so on, but you may not be, but you also now have to worry about keeping your job through it and paying the bills and getting your kids do their homework, etc.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that it also works the other way around? I mean, if adults find a way to children's literature, to middle grade, to YA, do you think that current times find their way into the literature, even if we're talking about science fiction or fantasy?
I'm so sorry, but this time I have to ask you to repeat it.
Okay. We know that adults find their way to children's literature and to middle grade literature and so on. The question is, do you think that it works the other way around? I mean, not from the side of the readers, but from the side of the writers. Do you think that adult predispositions find their way to the literature, even if we're talking about science fiction or fantasy?
I did not hear almost any of that. I'm so sorry. I'm looking to see if I can find a list of questions to see if it was on there. I can pick it up. I'm also wondering if I should try and change to my phone.
Okay.
Everyone, I'm so sorry about that. There were difficulties in my end.
I hope it will work itself out from now on. What I asked you before is, do you think it works also the other way around? I mean, not just that adults come to read children's literature or middle grade or YA, but that adults' predispositions or matters that affect adults find their way into the literature, even though it's a science fiction or fantasy.
Yes, absolutely. I know they certainly do with my own books. I have never sat down with the intent to write a political book, but my own concerns about world events will always find some kind of echo in what I write. So certainly The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart involves a lot of my own feelings about immigration as an immigrant myself. The sequel to it, The Girl with the Dragon Heart, that stars a refugee. And I wanted to write her story. The character's named Silka. I wanted to write Silka's story. I didn't want to write sort of a metaphor for anything else, but the fact that I came up with her story was very much related to my own concerns about refugees in the real world and about how my own country was treating them. Actually, both of my countries, the UK and America. And in similar ways, other issues will always come up, even in these fantasy environments. And I think I don't have the Ursula Le Guin quote memorized, but she said something in one of her essays about fantasy being a different way of writing the truth and, exploring real issues by giving them a slightly different context. And that's certainly how it works for me. Okay.
And this is, would you say, I don't know, allowed, advisable? I don't know, because normally people say that children's literature should be devoid of adult matters?
I would say none of these things are adult matters. There are child refugees right now waiting to be reunited with their families in the UK. And children are already experiencing all sorts of awful issues all over the world. If we don't want our books to be only for the very, very privileged and lucky children without problems, then we'll have to include some real world problems in our stories. And I would say even the children who are lucky and privileged need to learn and fantasy is a safe way for them to explore these questions where it isn't confronting them with this is what is happening to children in your world. This is what would it be like to be in this kind of situation in this not quite real world that's more safe because it's not real.
Okay, and Silka and other of the heroes and heroines in your books, at least in the Girl with the Dragon Heart, the books in the series, they're not white, are they?
Silka isn't, and neither is the third heroine in that trilogy, Sophia. Aventurine, I never clearly labeled, and I think all my cover designers have decided that she was white, which is fine. But Silka wasn't, and Sophia wasn't. My first heroine in my first series, which is called Cat Incorrigible, was white. So I would say the majority of my heroines have been, but not all of them.
So was that a conscious decision on your part, or was it just the way the idea came into your head?
Well, what happened with the Dragon trilogy is that I wrote The Dragon with a Chocolate Heart with the original intention of it being a standalone book. I had Aventurine's story in my head. I knew it would finish, and Aventurine's story arc would be finished. It wasn't like my first book where I knew, oh, I want to write lots of books about this girl, lots of having adventures. I knew that Aventurine, this would be her big adventure, and it would be closed off. But then, of course, I wrote her in this world that I wanted to feel diverse and rich and interesting, and I filled with other characters who were interesting to me. And I realized by the end of the first book that Silka deserved her own story. Mm-hmm. And so, and then it sort of happens for me a lot. The third book ended up being the younger princess, who is Sophia. And because she had been an interesting side character in the other ones, I was like, oh, I want to find out her story.
Mm-hmm. And Silka is also a tomboy of sorts.
Mm-hmm. She loves wearing boys' clothing, running through the streets. She's she was fun to write. And yeah.
You said earlier that you were in Austria learning music and opera. Did that time influence the way you imagined the surroundings in
Absolutely.
Because
Drakenberg is based on Vienna in terms of, I describe it as being like a snail, with the different districts circling outwards, which is exactly how Vienna is. And when I wrote my descriptions in book 2 of the Royal Palace, that was very much based on the Hofburg in Vienna, which I actually spent a lot of time in because it's now also the National Library. So, and then book 3, which isn't out yet in Israel, unfortunately, but basically that's set in Stockholm, in a fantasy version of Stockholm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What would you say is the importance of the division between children's literature, middle grade, and YA literature? I mean, before we didn't used to have all of these divisions, and we seem to have done fine.
Yeah, well, I think there's pros and cons, like most of the divisions. There are people who will argue now that we shouldn't have a separate science fiction section in the bookstore or a separate romance section. And then there are people who love it because that helps them find exactly what they're looking for at any particular time. As a parent, I certainly find it makes my life simpler when I know which section of the bookstore I can go to look for my 7-year-old. Yeah, look for my 7-year-old's books, as opposed to ones, for my 12-year-old. But it's really all a matter of, it's sort of guidance and guesswork, really, because there will be some 7-year-old. I would say it's really guidance and guesswork, because there's a fine balance with children's literature between guessing your reading maturity based on how much you can read and understand, versus guessing which subjects you're ready to handle and how much explicitness. So I wouldn't say that there are any really hard and fast lines, but a lot of people do find it helpful when they're shopping for others, especially.
Okay. Let's see. Both the dragon with a chocolate heart and the girl with the dragon heart feature young, strong female protagonists, but so do other of your middle grade books, such as The Princess Who Flew with Dragons and the Cat books, which haven't been translated into Hebrew. Is that a conscious decision on your part to focus on female protagonists? And would you say that you write primarily for girl readers?
I don't write primarily for girl readers. However, I write primarily female protagonists, and that is because when I came back to middle grade literature as an adult, I was shocked by a big truth I found when I was first coming back to it in the late 90s, which is better now. We're in a much better situation now than we used to be. But at that point in the late 90s, when I was going through not just the library in Vienna and the British Council Library, but then my own public library back at home in America at that point, I kept finding that in middle grade, female protagonists had romances and male protagonists had adventures. And I love romance. However, I got really frustrated about that. I wanted books where girls got to have magical adventures too. And as I said, things are much better now than they were back in the 90s, thank goodness. But that certainly sort of sparked me off. Having said that, right now the book I'm working on is the first book for children that I've written that does have a male protagonist. I've done it before with adult books. I have 2 full-length adult books, Masks and Shadows and Congress of Secrets. And both of those, there are multiple men as point of view characters. But this is my first time in a children's book. So it's not a hard and fast rule for me that it has to be only girls. It just tends to be more often.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say that you prepare yourself maybe differently to write a boy, if at all?
I just think of him as a person, much as I would think of the girls as people. And it certainly helps. I had some experience teaching when I was younger. I actually taught in Vienna. I taught English at a secondary school in Vienna. I was then a daycare teacher in America for a while, and then I taught undergraduates music history before having my own children. So it was certainly enough experience with both genders to figure out that they're just people. And having 2 sons myself, I certainly get a lot of day-to-day experience, and certainly what those 2 particular boys in the world care about and are thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're in a weird time in the world.
Yes, we are.
Sort of affecting all of us. Do you think that everything that's going on with COVID-19 affects your writing in any way?
Well, it affects it in a very big, obvious way in the beginning, which is it makes it very hard to write because I have 2 children at home. I had them at home full time during lockdown. We're preparing to see if there's going to be a second lockdown here in Wales. Right now, it hasn't been, but for various reasons related to it, my older son has been home a lot more than usual. My husband actually got COVID-19 this spring. It was really bad. He's still dealing with post-COVID issues. It's a very long, awful, debilitating disease. So, on a very basic level, it's made it much harder for me to write. Even apart from the sort of general malaise and anxiety that so many of us would just feel anyway. However, it's also given me an enormous amount of inspiration in terms of how necessary I think writing is right now. The only reason I've gotten through this year was because of the books that I read. A lot of them were comfort rereads or new books that I could just escape into and feel some hope and escape. I might have been locked in the house, but in the pages of the book, I was out in the outer world having fabulous adventures. And I really, really want to supply that to other people. I think there's never been a more intensely worthwhile time to be releasing stories to help other people escape, from their own lockdowns and their own anxieties right now.
Do you have your COVID recommendation list?
Well, I would say I'm part of 2 different anthologies that were specifically aimed to cheer people up during it. There's one for adults. It's called Consolation Songs, Ballads for a Time of Coronavirus. It's edited by Iona Dat Sharma. And along with my story, which is about a young editor in London who is forced to have an unwanted flatmate during the coronavirus, who is actually a fairy, and they find each other incredibly irritating, and of course they fall in love, and it's very silly and very fun. But besides my story, there are stories by Aliette de Bedard, Adrian Tchaikovsky, tons of other wonderful writers. And then for middle grade, I'm part of an anthology that just came out in hardcover this past week in the UK, but it's available from the Book Depository for all over the world. It's called The Book of Hopes. It's edited by Catherine Rundell, and she got over 100 UK children's literature authors and artists to all donate stories or poems or pieces of art that were specifically designed. They're all very, very short. Our limit was 500 words, and it was just something to perk people up and perk kids up especially, and give them some comfort and some escape and some entertainment. And it's a really lovely anthology. The lineup is incredible. There's Jacqueline Wilson and Hilary Mackay and most famous British children's literature authors have stories in there.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this crisis it affects the publishing world as well, or does it simply go on as usual? I mean, bookstores are closed.
100%. Yeah, with bookstores being closed, I mean, that's a huge issue for sales. And even when bookstores are open, I'm certainly not the only person I know who feels uncomfortable going out into shops right now. And I'm ordering online, which from my local bookstore to try to make up for it as much as I can. But also on very basic levels, I just got an email from my American editor telling me that the paperback edition of my last book, The Princess Who Flew with Dragons, has been delayed because there's a paper shortage, it's a printing supply shortage between just all people who've gotten sick and factories having to take breaks and all sorts of other issues related to the virus. Just a lot of things are getting delayed or put off. I know in America, a lot of people aren't getting advanced reading copies printed anymore because there's just not enough paper and it has to be prioritized.
And maybe like a final question about COVID. Do you think that, maybe a few months from now or a year from now, we will start seeing books, children's books with COVID in them? Or people
I
with
wouldn't be
masks?
surprised.
Come again?
Well, I'm lucky because I write middle grade fantasy. I'm lucky because I write fantasy and it's set in a secondary world mostly. So although I wrote that one short story set in contemporary London with the virus, most of my books and stories, they aren't affected necessarily by things happening right now. However, all of my friends I know who write children's books that are realistic contemporary books, they're really stuck. They're not sure whether they should be talking about it or not, because of course books come out 1 or 2 years after they're turned in. And none of us knows what the world is going to be like exactly at that point. And it's very hard to know how to write about it all.
I had another question, which I think maybe you've answered. Do you think boys and girls need different books? And if so, why?
Absolutely not. I would say, I was born in the late 70s, and I grew up being given books starring boys and nonstop, like every other girl I know of my age group. And it didn't stop me being able to empathize with them. It's just frustrating that there wasn't more of a balance being offered, because, it's always been considered fine by parents and so on to give their daughters books starring boys, but not the other way around, that it would somehow effeminize the boys or something. I don't know. It's not a reasonable thing, I think. It's good for girls to be able to empathize with boys and boys-specific issues within our society. It's also extremely important for boys to be able to empathize with girls and their issues in our society. I would say one isn't more important than the other. And no one is going to become unwantedly masculinized or feminized by reading about people from the opposite gender, or from a different gender, I should say.
And yet you did say that books for boys tend to be more of the adventurous kind, and books for girls tend to be more romantic, if I understood
They
correctly.
used to be. Yeah. When I first started writing, and when I first started reading middle grade fiction again in my late 20s, that was the situation. And I was really irritated by it, because I thought, I was a girl who grew up loving fantasy adventure. I want to see girls having fantasy adventures in here. It's not that girls don't like them. And I think ideally there's a mix. I think everybody should get the chance to see themselves on the screen, basically. However, I also think it's important for everybody to see everybody else on the screen. And that's why it's so important that there are plenty of different kinds of stories for boys and girls and non-binary people, and all different sorts of ethnicities and everything else. It doesn't mean we can't read about each other. We should read about each other, but we also should have mirrors available for ourselves and to reflect our own experiences as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, in preparing for this conversation, I checked your biography and bibliography, and I saw that, for example, Cat Incorrigible became a most improper magic became Cat Incorrigible, renegade magic in the US, a tangle of magics in the UK, stolen magic in the US, a reckless magic in the UK. Why do the cat books have different names in the US and the UK, and why is it important? Why was it important?
Well, I had different publishers in the two countries, and they couldn't agree on a title, basically, is the answer. For my own part, I will say I have found it awkward over the years to have the two different titles, because I never want anyone feeling tricked by thinking they're buying a new book from me and finding out that it's just the same book with a different title for a different country. However, every publishing house has their own ideas about what makes a commercial cover, or what makes a commercial title, etc. And it's particularly exacerbated if you have two different publishers. So, for instance, my first books were published by Simon & Schuster in the US and by Templar Books in the UK. Now, with my last few books, I've been publishing with Bloomsbury in both countries, and that makes it a lot easier to communicate. And it's why I've had the same title for every book in both countries, which is wonderful. But I still have different covers, because generally the feeling has been that American kids respond better to particular covers, and that are different from UK children. There are different styles that are popular and so on. And you always want it to be whatever's going to appeal to the people in that country, particularly. And it's been interesting, because The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart has been translated into so many languages now, and seeing all the various different titles that it gets, and the different names that children get, and the names that the characters get, and so on.
Mm-hmm. But in the sense that books are like children, if I may ask, then what's the real name? What are the books really called?
Well, I will tell you that when I wrote the first cat book, it was called Cat by Moonlight. And none of my publishers wanted that. I have given up on ever assuming that something I call a book will ever stay its title. The marketing department gets to make that final choice, really. I can veto things, but I'm trying to think. The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart kept the title that I gave it. And The Raven Heir, which is my next book coming out in the UK and US next year, that kept the title I gave it. That's 2 books out of 10 so far. Mm-hmm. Everything else, I just can't let myself attach to the title. The book itself is what matters to me anyway.
If you mentioned the Raven Heir, then we have a question from the audience who really wanted to know how far along are you in the draft and what can you tell us about it?
Well, luckily, The Raven Heir, the full draft is already complete. It's actually going to copy edits this week. And it came out of my strange obsession with the Wars of the Roses here in the UK, because when I moved to Wales, it was I moved to the UK for my husband, to be perfectly frank. We met at Clarion West in Seattle in America, and I moved to the UK so I would be with him. But we lived in various parts of England, and then we moved to Wales, to be near some of his family, but also I fell in love with all the castles. And castles come with history. And a lot of the Wars of the Roses took place around us. The little castle that I've spent so much time at with both of my children is the same one where Henry VII was raised as a child. He stood on the battlements watching a battle between his own family, who were the attackers, and his guardian's family, who were basically keeping him prisoner. It's just drenched in history that's both very upsetting and really fascinating as an author. And so The Raven Heir comes from the fact that when I was reading all these books about the Wars of the Roses, which were these incredibly brutal wars over the throne that had no justification really, except for different families wrestling for power, so many times the actual quote unquote kings or queens to be put on the throne, or that the families were wrestling to get onto the throne, were children. They were middle grade aged. These 11 or 12-year-olds were being put into disguise as peasants and then raced across the country in the middle of the night, and all these fantastically middle grade things to happen. And it made me think about what it would be like to be a child in that situation where you have no control and yet everyone's claiming to be fighting for you and your life is at stake over this stuff. So that was the beginning inspiration. And then we add in some magical forests and a shape-shifting heroine and all sorts of magical, just fantasy fun.
And can you tell us something about the next book?
The next one is called The Raven Throne so far. I'm not counting on Bloomsbury letting me keep the title, but right now it's The Raven Throne. I'm about a third of the way into the draft, and it's about what happens afterwards. Like after you win the throne, well, life doesn't actually get easy. And what's going to happen then?
To the viewers at home, I want to say that I do see questions, but I will ask Stéphanie some questions, but eventually we will also get to your questions as well. Okay, so perhaps since Harry Potter, there has been a great boom in children's and YA literature. Do you think this boom is beneficial to this literary form, or does this sort of inflation of titles bring with it a decrease in quality in the books we get?
I think it's always good to get more diversity, to get more attention and respect for the genre. Certainly there are books that I don't enjoy. There will always be books that you don't feel are the best in the genre. However, that's true for every genre. And certainly the fact that the field has more money, it has more respect, it has more space in the bookstore now, is a very good thing for attracting writers who can actually afford to spend their time working on these books. And that's been really beneficial. I certainly, for all that I grew up with wonderful books, and there are writers, I still love, I am very excited about the time we're going through right now for children's literature. I think it's incredibly vibrant, and there's so much variety to choose from, which is just amazing.
Mm-hmm. But do you not, or maybe do you get a sense that it's become a sort of a business? Because now...
It always has been.
Come again?
It always has been, though. I mean, it is a business as well as an art. Mm-hmm. And I wish we still lived in the days... sometimes I think every writer has little wistful thoughts about being in the days of Tolkien, when his editor could write to the head of the publishing company and say, I don't think The Lord of the Rings will sell any copies, but I believe it's a work of genius. How much money can I lose on it? Mm-hmm. It's a lovely kind of fancy, that idea right now, because publishers do have to justify their expenses much more now than in the old days. And that certainly puts pressure on authors. But I think, as an author, I'm very grateful that I can live off of my writing. That makes a humongous difference for me and for my family, especially because I also have a chronic illness, which means I have to work at home. So, I'm never going to think it's a bad thing that middle grade literature is bringing in enough money to help support authors.
Mentioning your illness, if I may be so bold as to ask, your biographies say that you suffer or suffered from a CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yes.
How would you say that suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome has influenced your writing, both, on the technical level, but also maybe in terms of the story itself?
It very strongly influenced me right at the beginning because it changed what I wrote. Before I got, normally I'd say ME, which is the UK term for CFS. But before I got ME, then I was writing some very dark stuff. And I was writing historical fantasy for adults. And actually, a couple of my books have now been published many years later, and given readers a very strange idea of my progression, because I wrote these books and then I set them aside. I started publishing children's books, and then they actually got published later on. Anyway, point is, I was writing some very dark stuff, and I was exploring these very dark issues. And then I got sick. I got very sick. I had to give up my day job, which had been working for an opera company. I was extremely upset about it. I've always been someone who prided herself on hard work and achievement, and it felt terrible. I mean, to have this illness that couldn't be cured, and that meant I couldn't bring in, income. I was having to rely on my husband for income, which I hated having to do. I felt awful. I went through a lot of depression and grief, and I didn't want to write dark stuff anymore. I wanted to write things that would help me escape. And I wanted to write the kind of books that were getting me through that terrible time. So that was when I started writing my first cat book. And, I was in my real life at that point. I was going through this awful dark time where I was at the worst of my ME. I was lying on a couch most of the day. I couldn't go out, but I got to write about a cat jumping on a highwayman's horse, and riding off to save the day. And it was so much fun. And from then on, I really never wanted to go back to writing these sort of studying the darkness in my stories. I've always wanted to write things that are fun and frothy without being shallow. I want to write books that are very heartfelt and address serious things, but are going to leave you feeling better and leave readers feeling empowered and comforted and like there's hope, because I know how badly I've needed that at various points, particularly since that illness came. And that really became my guiding mission as a writer.
And on a technical level, how would you say, writing with chronic fatigue syndrome is not easy. So How did you manage the two?
I had to learn to write in manageable short chunks. I had to embrace baby steps and small, tiny doable goals is my thing. Tiny doable goals and tortoise writing, I also call it. Because as a writer, there's a lot of competitiveness at work sometimes. You're looking at your friends on Twitter, and they're like, I just wrote 2,000 words. And you think, oh, wow, that would be great. I'm like, well, here's my 200 words for the session, and now I've got to lie down. But however, like tortoise writing reminds me that the tortoise won the race. I mean, not that I necessarily want to actually compete with my friends. I want them to also do well, but I will get there is the point. If I keep doing those little sessions, sometimes I do 6 tiny sessions through the day where I write, maybe 100 words in a session. I get there in the end. I get the finished book, and it still works. And so that it's been really, I had to train myself to think that way about the writing. I would also say in an unexpected way, it forced me to learn to be more flexible as an author, because my plan had never been necessarily to be a full-time author before I got sick. I thought of that as a fantasy. I would have loved to be a full-time author, but I knew it wasn't very realistic. And then after I got sick, writing was the only thing I could do, which meant that when I went through a period in between selling books, I ended up having to take a job as a work-for-hire author, working for a packaging company, writing under a series pen name, and writing to someone else's synopsis and having to match their writing style. And it's the kind of thing I would never have known how to do, and I wouldn't have challenged myself to do if I hadn't had to. If I'd still been, being a website editor is my day job. But actually, as glad as I am now to be supporting myself on my own writing with my own stories, I feel like I learned a lot from the couple of years when I did that work for hire writing, and I had to learn to write that way.
You repeat that last sentence because it got cut off?
Oh, no. All right. What was the last thing you heard me say?
The last sentence, you said that you had to encourage yourself and learn things that you wouldn't have found yourself doing otherwise. And then you said something else.
Yes. So I had to learn, I had to learn how to match other people's writing styles. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I had to learn how to match other people's writing styles, write other people's stories as a work for hire writer for a couple of years. And although I wouldn't call that soul satisfying work, I'm glad not to have to do it at this point in my life. It also taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about meeting deadlines. It taught me a lot about trying different styles and seeing what I could do. And that was really useful for me in the long term.
Thank you very much. Now I want to start bringing up some questions from the audience. So someone asked, when you start writing a new novel, do you decide already from the start about your audience, or do you prefer to first finish the story and then decide only afterwards what works for you? Or maybe your agents decide for you about the audience?
I would say when I first start a novel, I generally have just an idea in my head. Maybe I was out on a walk and suddenly I got this image in my head, and I try to get that down. And then I figure out fairly quickly within the first scene what age group it's aimed at. And that's largely based on who the characters are. If they're adult characters that I see in that situation, then very clearly it will be an adult book. It has to be. If it's children characters, etc. It's trying to figure out. I write books very much around my characters. We don't start with plot necessarily. I start with, who is this person? What do they want? And so I can't get very far in the book without knowing who the main character is. And there's a big difference if they're 12 versus 17 or 35. So I know pretty much straight away. Although I will say, fairly early in my career, I tried experimenting with writing YA and found it's such a different voice from middle grade and from adults. I couldn't make myself work that way for more than a short story. It ended up reading like a middle grade book about older people, which was useless. So you also have to, learn your own strengths and weaknesses.
In what sense was it different? In what sense was it different?
I didn't quite catch that.
In what sense was it different to write YA than middle grade, from middle grade?
Well, yeah. YA is much more internally focused than middle grade. Actually, it's more internally focused, I think, than either middle grade or adult fiction, which is part of why I do well with both of those, but I struggle to write YA. And I've never done it successfully for longer than a novella. I think it's just a different way of looking at the world, and it's trying, when you're a teenager, you get this very intense focus. It's an inward focus because you're figuring out who you are and you're separating from your parents. And I mean, there's bits of brain chemistry that make us kind of self-obsessed for a while, to be honest. And it's just such a different mindset than either middle grade or adult. And I am always in awe of the YA writers who capture it so beautifully, and I love reading their work. For myself, I'm much better at getting back into the mindset of a 12-year-old than a 16-year-old. I don't know why, but there it is.
So we won't get to see Silka and Evangeline move up in age towards YA? No.
Probably not. I mean, you never know. Maybe in 20 years, I'll think differently.
Okay. Moving on. How did you come by connecting two wonderful things, dragons and chocolate, in one book?
Dragons and chocolate. I missed some of that. I heard you saying connecting two wonderful things, dragons and chocolate.
How did you come by the idea of connecting those two into a book? It's sort of like, I don't know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory meets something with dragons. How my first dragon.
Yes, it was really when I'm between books, what I often do is I make lots of lists in a notebook, and I call them my love lists. Like, here are things I love in books, here are things I love in real life. How could I jumble some of them together? And I had been making lots of love lists, for myself in this sort of period in between books and being stuck. And one night, actually, just as I was getting my younger son, who's then a baby, to bed, I got him to sleep. I turned off a light. I was desperate for sleep, and I suddenly thought, oh, dragons and chocolate, and I leapt up. Which was really saying something because I was very sleep deprived at that point. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I had that, it was just, I knew I wanted to write that book, and I got the opening down that night, and then it was just a matter of figuring out the larger story. Mm-hmm. But so it came serendipitously, just to sort of train my subconscious to be turning over different combinations.
So you're saying sleep deprivation is an important part of the creation process.
Yes, it's a very serendipitous creation process.
Okay, so someone else, I don't know who, first wanted to tell you that they love your books. And
Hooray. Thank you.
Yes. And can you talk a little about how you set your mood, how you set your mindset to write in specific the dragon with the chocolate heart, because it felt like such a fresh and consistent character, and yet different from dragons as we know them?
Well, I live in a country that has dragons as its national animal. I love that about Wales. You can't walk down our high street without seeing dragon paraphernalia everywhere. We're surrounded by mountains, and even before I ever came up with the idea, I used to always say to my older son, you know, when we saw the mist on the mountain, we'd be like, "Oh, that's the dragon's breath." You know, the dragons are breathing out, and now, you know, when it gets thick enough, they'll be flying out. You know, they'll come out from the mountain and they'll fly in behind the mist. And so I was already in a dragon mood from the moment I moved to Wales, really. I'd always loved dragons since I was a kid, and I discovered Smaug in The Hobbit. And then the way I came up with my dragons was really, I was thinking, if they live all the time under the mountains, as has been true in an awful lot of dragon lore, what are they doing down there? I mean, wouldn't they get bored, especially if they're supposed to be really smart? You know, and because, you know, my first impression of dragons, again, was Smaug and who's incredibly intelligent, and that's what makes him scary, as well as the physical power. So then I started thinking about what they would be doing, and of course, they're actually quite academic, and and each of them has their own passion. And you know, from there, I came up with my dragon, whose passion would turn out to be chocolate, but she'd have to leave the cave to get to it.
Okay. And another question that came up is: do you think that dragon society is matriarchal because we never hear of Aventurine's father?
No, it's her grandfather and aunts and her mother are there. And well, in my personal little backstory, it doesn't come out in the books, so people can feel free to replace it as much as they like in any kind of fanfic situation. But in my personal backstory, the father flew off, and he wasn't. In my version, each dragon family will decide on one parent to look after the eggs. And in the grandfather's case, he was the one who stayed with the eggs. And in the mother's case, she was the one who stayed with her eggs. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You said you read to your kids. Do any of the ideas from the books you read, or maybe you read to your kids, find their way into your books?
Well, obviously I try to avoid plagiarism. However, I'm sure it's all circling around. You know, I'm influenced by everything I read at some level. And before I had children who were old enough for middle grade novels, you know, I was just reading them to myself. Now I read them with my kids and we talk about them, and it gets me thinking about, well, how would I handle something like that, certainly, in my work. And I talk about my own books with my children a lot. When I was writing The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart, I spent a lot of time talking about the story with my kids as I was writing it. And similarly, again, with Raven Air, that was one where, because the heroine is a shapeshifter, and so I had lots and lots of conversations with my children about what animals would be fun to turn into and what it would be like to be those different animals and so on.
So basically, you're using your children for child labor for ideas for your books. Speaking of which,
100%.
Coming in? 100%. Yes. Are the characters from The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart based on real people? Are the characters from Dragon with the Chocolate Heart based on real people?
No, I so far never based anyone on a real person. I try to make every character very real and distinct in my mind as I write them, even the side characters, which means they'll have their own kinds of backstories and so on. However, I'm sure, again, the way I see people, you know, and the kind of people I met certainly will affect it. And I would say every so often, very, very rarely, I had one experience soon after I started publishing when I went to a children's literature festival and I met another author who was so horrific. as we said goodbye, I thought, oh, I would love to write you in the book. I would love to do that. Up.
You said that you went to a festival, a book festival?
Yes, I went to a festival. And I met an author there who was so sneery about the particular publisher I was with at that point that I was standing there. I had to be polite, but I was thinking in my head, I would love to write you into a book one day. And I'm sure something about her attitude has led into a couple of my characters now, the ones I really dislike.
Mm-hmm. Do you plan, ran away. Do you plan to write stories about different characters or other places in the world of The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart?
Different characters from my dragon book?
Different characters and or different places from the world you created for The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart.
Right now, I don't have any specific plans for that. I have written various tie-in short stories that people can find through my website, and it's very possible I'll write a few more of those as gifts for my readers. Usually once a year, I write a tie-in short story connected to one of my books or one of my series, and so there may be more stories set in that world, but unless my publisher changes their mind and asks for more in that world, probably no full-length novels, because I do have to follow their guidance a bit. And they would challenge me to come up with something new for the next series, which I have done.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, maybe the idea for your books or your next book trickles down from your publishers rather than come from you?
It's a mix. When I finished writing the last of the Dragon books, my publishers invited me to a meeting in London, and where we talked about what general kind of book they were most hoping to see from me next. But it was very general. I think my editor said she wanted it to be, she really wanted a book that would have a strong female heroine thrown in over her head. So, and something big and epic. So I said, sure, sounds good to me. And I went home and I drew a complete blank for the next 2 months. But finally, as I've been sitting there reading War of the Roses books, just out of, just to entertain myself, suddenly those things clicked. And I suddenly had my heroine who was in that situation in a fantasy setting, and it was big and epic with a whole kingdom at stake. So, I could have said no, written something different, and tried for a different publisher, but I also trust my editor a lot right now, and I think she has a really good eye for what's good for me, what's good for my career. So I'm happy to work with her on that.
Mm-hmm. Now you write both short stories and long stories, whereas many, not all of course, but many authors either limit themselves to short stories or write long prose or long form. So how do you know when an idea is an idea for a short story or if there's a book in there?
It's really just something I've managed to finally learn over the years, how to recognize a short story idea versus a novel idea. Because novel ideas need to be so much more complex. And actually, it was a problem when I started writing novels before I started writing short stories. And I didn't really learn how to write short stories until I went to the Clarion West workshop. And what I kept, until I learned better through Clarion, I kept writing the first chapter of a novel and thinking it was a short story. And I had to learn the different pacing of a story versus a novel. I had to learn what makes a really nice, complete little arc for a story as compared to a comparable amount in a novel. So there's no particular trick to it, just learning when I get an idea to say, oh, what does that feel like? Does that feel like something I could turn into a whole novel, or would that be a nice little, one-page flash fiction, for instance?
Were there instances when you thought you were writing a short story, but then you found out that you're actually writing a book, or the other way around, that you thought that you were writing a book, but then found out that you only have a short story?
So far, it's only happened the other way around once. And what that was I started writing what I thought was the first chapter of a sequel to one of my adult books. And I'd even gotten as far as talking to my adult editor about it, saying, what would you think if I wrote a book? There's a sequel, it was kind of like this. And she said, that sounds great. Write me the first 4 chapters, send me a synopsis, we'll see. And then I sold The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart. And suddenly I realized that what I really wanted to do was focus on those books for a while, because with 2 young children and a chronic illness, I've got limited energy. And so I can only really produce 1 full-length novel a year. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to overcommit myself, because I knew what I wanted really to focus on was these middle grade books right now. And so that's why I switched around that time to writing adult novellas instead. I've been mostly publishing adult novellas ever since then, because I don't have time to write full-length novel in 2 genres every single year. So the story, what was going to be the opening of the first chapter of the sequel, I sort of tweaked it and twisted it and gave it a little ending, within a discrete arc. And I published it as, I think was it Shadow Duet? I think that might have been the title, something like that. Anyway, I published it as just a little tiny short story, just a little, here, this is what, if you're curious about what happened next, here's a little scene from their future life, Mm-hmm. But I took out all the things that I had been building up in there when I was building up to a larger storyline.
Okay. And does it happen that ideas that you have and maybe didn't mature into a full story or mature into a full book, sort of bleed into another book, into another story, rather maybe merge different ideas into one?
Yes, actually, I had started writing a different book to be my next middle grade book, and it wasn't what my editor was interested in having me do next, because she wanted me to sort of go bigger with my next series, do something more epic, higher stakes. And this was actually more domestic and lower stakes. But I ended up using I've been so in the mood to write a book set in the woods, which is where the first idea was. And so my big epic book turned out, surprise, surprise, to be set in an enchanted woods after all. And it was just a very different angle on it. And quite often that's what ends up happening, is I take out little bits from the stories that I don't end up using and find a place where they really fit in the better ones.
Mm-hmm. Now a question that came from the audience. If someone sort of got their start and got published writing short stories, but they want to move from short stories to long form, then how would you recommend to make the sort of transition from short story to long form?
Well, my biggest advice is actually the same thing I would give in reverse to novelists who want to start writing short stories. You need to read just tons of them, immerse yourself in it to get the pacing in your head and really internalize the pacing, because it's such different pacing in the 2 different things. I know people who write beautiful short stories and have struggled to write novels because they end up writing sort of one short story after another instead of one chapter after another. And there's the inclination that, oh, this is a story length, and so you have a nice concise ending at the end of each chapter, whereas actually chapters should be at the end of one chapter you should be desperate to read the next. Basically, you you need to leave readers hanging in many ways. You can't have these neat little short stories one in a row. So if you're struggling to find your way into novels, I would force yourself to read, 10 or 20 novels in a row before you let yourself read any more short stories, and to really immerse yourself in it and get yourself thinking a story in that structure. And similarly, for novelists or the short stories, you've got to read them. Otherwise, you just can't write good short stories.
So do you think that you read differently as a writer than other readers, or do you have like two kinds of reading? One reading as a writer who is looking for something, and another kind of reading for fun?
Definitely two kinds. Yeah, because I've learned to read analytically as a writer, and that's very useful when I'm critiquing work from my friends, because I have a group of friends who we all trade our work around, and we critique each other's work, and it's fantastically helpful. But that would make you miserable, I think, to read books that way all the time, because it would take away all the joy. When you sit down and you want to relax with a book, at least I don't want to sit there thinking, ooh, this could have been moved over here. And you have to find some way of shutting down and saying, look, I'm not here as their editor. I am here, as someone who wants to be swept away. And I know that was something that many people struggle with right after they go to a workshop like Clarion, is shutting off that critical voice in your head and letting yourself just be a reader again. But actually, for all sorts of reasons, but mostly just to have an enjoyable life, I've forced myself to turn that little voice off when I'm reading for fun.
People have this image in their head of the solitary writer, sitting alone at night, working away to the wee small hours of night. And yet you mentioned working with friends and working with a group. How would you say writing in a group is important or beneficial?
Well, I live with another writer. So before we had children, and then in times when both of our children have been at school together again, we like sitting in the same room to write because it's actually really helpful. We don't look at each other's keyboards as we're writing. That would be horrible and paralyzing, at least for me. But it's great. It's very motivating to see someone else writing across from you. You're like, oh yeah, I should be getting to work too. Right? It makes it much easier with willpower if you see other people writing around you. And similarly with online writers groups and groups of writer friends, it's a great motivator because it takes a lot of willpower. It's like going out on a jog, Before Emmy, I really liked jogging, but even though I knew I would like it once I was out there, it was such a struggle to make myself put on the running shoes and do the stretches and actually leave the comfortable house and go running. And writing is a lot the same way. You're like, oh, it's gonna be hard work. It just sounds ridiculous, but and you have to come up with these characters. It's not that hard, but when you're sitting there ready to go, it feels like hard work. And it's very motivational to have a group of other people who are going through the same thing. That was one of the most useful things that came for me out of going to Clarion West workshop, was getting a group of other writers who would be checking in on each other, even aside from critiquing each other's things, to say, I wrote this week, how about you? Nowadays, whenever I'm writing a novel, because it's such a long haul thing for me, especially with my tourist writing. Could
you repeat the last sentence? Nowadays?
I would say nowadays, whenever I'm writing a novel, whenever I write a whole novel, because it is a very long haul project, especially with my tourist writing, I have friends I trust who beta read my chapters, and that's not critiquing them. It just means every time I finish a new chapter, I send it to my beta readers, and they write back with one thing they honestly liked from the book, from that chapter. It could be, if they're really desperate, the spelling was quite good. But it has to be one positive, honest thing from the chapter. And I think, woo, there's a point. I can keep writing. You know? And it helps so much to have the motivation of a group of people who all care about it.
Mm-hmm. And what about writer's jealousy when you work in a group?
I say that again. I didn't catch the beginning.
What about writer's jealousy when you work in a group and someone is published and someone isn't, someone is just about to publish?
It's unavoidable.
What?
Writing jealousy is unavoidable. It's unavoidable. When you all want something badly and you see someone else get it first, it's going to hurt, no matter how much you care about them. The only way I've ever found that works is to publicly celebrate and promote the people I'm most jealous of. I don't know why that kind of leaves the poison out of it, but somehow it reminds my subconscious. You know, I can be sitting there thinking, oh, she got a movie deal, I'm so jealous. But, you know, the moment I write a tweet and say, congratulations on this movie deal, fantastic. Suddenly, somehow in my subconscious, it sort of switches it over and it reminds me, oh, this is a nice thing. And it has not taken anything away from me.
Mm-hmm. By the way, one of the thoughts I had reading The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart is that I would so much have loved to see a movie with those characters, with that story.
Thank you.
Another question from the audience is, could you please explain a little bit about working with your editor and sort of dynamics between the two of you?
Say again?
If you could maybe expand about the dynamics, the relationship between you and your editor. How does that dynamic work?
I'm lucky. I'm very lucky with my editor. She's very demanding. She is not going to let me settle for a book that's good enough. And the books end up better for it. However, she is also very clear that my name is the one on the cover. That's what she always reminds me of. So I get to make final decisions. The thing that I found most useful is for my editor to point out when my books aren't working, and then I come up with a solution to it. I think there's a Neil Gaiman quote about it, actually. If someone points out something working in your book, they're probably right. If they have to fix it, they're probably wrong. Because everyone has their own ways of looking at the story. So my editors, every time they tell me something isn't working in my book, pretty much always I have to admit that they're right. Sometimes we disagree on how to fix it. And that's where I'm lucky that I do get the final say. But I also, I try not to misuse that. I believe them if I try to fix it and they say it's not fixed. Then I say, okay, I have to start again. So it depends on having a relationship of respect.
Okay. Just one second. A little technical issue. Yes. Okay, today. They said that we have limited time. So I wanted perhaps to sum up with a general question, which I like, and that is, do you have any tips for beginning authors who want to go into the field?
I would say read as many books as you can that have been published in just the last year or 2 years. It's really important. Don't let yourself get trapped into thinking in the patterns of older books that will feel old or already done to editors and agents right now. Do lots and lots of reading. If you possibly can, find a support group of other writers who are willing to all read each other's work and give suggestions. That's the most useful thing you can do, is finding people who are willing to help you become a better writer. And those are really my two top tips. It's just read voraciously and find people to tell you when you're not getting it right.
Okay. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And
thank you
I
so
apologize
much
to the viewers at home for the technical difficulties.
You have 10 more minutes.
And
it's okay.
Excuse me, Stephanie, you started saying something.
I was just saying, I am so sorry for the technical difficulties. I don't know why my Wi-Fi is being so temperamental today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, final question just came in. And they say it's a very important question. Can we meet Pebbles?
So what was the important question?
If the audience wanted to know if they can meet Pebbles.
Oh, I wish they could. My children just came home from school, so Pebbles is downstairs yelling at them for being gone. Pebbles does not approve of the children going to school. She liked lockdown. Any other time, I would have happily let you all meet Pebbles.
And they also ask for a guest appearance of your cat. If it's around.
Something around?
They also ask for a guest appearance of your cat if it's around.
That's Pebbles.
That's Pebbles. Okay.
I'm so sorry, everyone. An hour earlier.
That's quite all right. So thank you, and thank you to the viewers at home. It was a pleasure, and we hope that someday soon, all this business with COVID-19 is going to end, and perhaps we're going to get to see you face to face. So thank you.
That would be wonderful.
Good night.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you so much.